Welcome to The Sacramentalists, a podcast where the ancient Christian faith is brought to bear on issues prevalent in modern culture. I'm your host for today, Father Wesley Walker. Unfortunately, Father Creighton couldn't join us today, but we are joined by Father Greg Peters. He's the vicar of Church of the Epiphany in La Mirada, California. He has a PhD in Christian history from St. Michael's College, Toronto, and is currently working on an SMD in monastic studies. You'll have to tell me how to say the name of the university.
Ateneo di Sant'Anselmo.
That one, in Rome. He's the professor of Medieval and Spiritual Theology at the Torrey Honors College at Biola University and the Servants of Christ research professor at Nashotah House Theological Seminary. He's written a number of books, and articles, probably books that listeners of this show are familiar with: The Monkhood of All Believers, Becoming a Community of Disciples, and the Story of Monasticism. Perhaps more important than any of these excellent academic and literary achievements, however, is the fact that he is a native of Lynchburg, Virginia, which is a fantastic city.
Yes, very proud of that.
Well, Father Greg, thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have you. You're one of those people who I feel like we probably should have already had on 3 or 4 times before today.
Oh, well, I'm glad to be here now.
Better late than never.
Exactly.
So the reason we wanted to have you on this time is an upcoming conference at Nashotah House Theological Seminary in Wisconsin. So could you tell the listeners about the Breck Conference just in general? I mean, what is it? How did it come about? What exactly does it entail?
Love to. So there was a now closed, unfortunately, Anglican religious community in the Phoenix area, and it's closed because of lack of vocations. And so the last abbot, and perhaps, I think he was the founder as well of that community, was a son of the house. And so as they realized they were going to have to close things up, and they've the last 2 months have since passed. They gave a gift to Nashotah House for the purpose of endowing a chair and but creating a conference. And so Dr. Anderson, dean of the house, at least at the time he was interim dean, they sat in faculty meetings and said, well, who's going to call Greg Peters? Talking about monasticism in an Anglican context, let's call Greg. So he asked me if I'd like to come on board as a research professor, but also start this conference. And I said, under one condition, that the conference be about recovering the monastic tradition for the sake of the church, the contemporary church. So I didn't want to talk about 13th century French refectory paintings, even though that would be really interesting. And so he said, yeah, that sounds great. That's exactly what we want. So I came on board in 2018 and spent a year developing the conference. We named it after one of the founders of Nashotah House, James Lloyd Breck, because he had written a letter to his brother after volunteering to come to the Wisconsin territory, where he said, we're going to go out and found a religious house. And so he very much understood Nashotah House to be kind of a monastic in its inspiration and origins. And so we named it after him, and we had our first one in 2019, which went swimmingly, and then 2020 got canceled. And then so we've come back again, but it's a day and a half with an optional another day and a half of pre-conference if you want to come and just learn more from me. But then the conference itself is like a Thursday afternoon and evening and into all day Friday. And we invite people to come to recover something from the monastic tradition, but to speak to the contemporary church. So we wanted to have very contemporary application, if possible. And then we build in lots of time for people to enjoy Nashotah House, of course, but also to just talk with one another. Like, what are your thoughts about putting this into the parish, or what would this look like in your parish? So,
very cool. Very cool. Every year has been a very interesting topic when you all have held it, but this year's topic, I think, is especially interesting because it's on E.B. Pusey and monasticism. And I think most of our listeners will be familiar with Pusey, but it might help kind of in general just to take a step back and maybe talk a little bit about who he was, why he's important just as a figure in Anglicanism.
Sure. Yeah. So again, I mean, a lot of people probably know him, but what most of us know in general about him is, of course, he was one of the founding members of the Oxford movement. In as much as we could talk about founding members, wasn't necessarily a planned thing to happen, but and that's because he had been a fellow at Oriel College with Keble, with John Henry Newman, with Hurrell Froude, the first 4, kind of the core of the Oxford movement. He himself was of those 4. Froude died young. Keble and Pusey, of course, remained Anglicans, but Keble left Oxford for parish ministry. And even when he became the Oxford professor of poetry, that was non-residential. And so Pusey was the one who stayed in Oxford. He was Regius Professor of Hebrew and a canon of Christ Church, where he lived and was buried his entire life. I think one of the main things that makes him interesting in the context of the Breck Conference is his deep involvement with the initial origins of reintroduction of monasticism into the Anglican Church. So, like, for example, and we'll talk more about this, but when Marian Hughes, who was the first woman to take monastic vows since the dissolution in 1842, she knew Pusey through a common priest friend. And so he was the one who actually heard her make those vows on Trinity Sunday, 1842. So when she vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, that was to God, but in the presence of Pusey. And then she went over to St. Mary the Virgin Church to receive communion from Newman, who was aware of what had just happened. And that was the fruit of a lot of work that Pusey had been doing on behalf of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was clearly very important. So who's going to be speaking at the conference on this topic?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about picking, because in some consultation with people, I pick the topics, and we had done some patristic things, and so I thought it'd be more to pick something that's in Anglicanism, but like to recover that element of Anglicanism for the sake of the contemporary church, even though it's not that long ago. And so I had settled, in general on the Oxford movement, and I settled on Pusey. And as I started thinking about who could come do those talks, I happened to be reading Father Toby Karlowitz's The Sacramental Vision of, Edward Bouverie Pusey. Excellent book from T&T Clark in 2021. And of course, Father Toby is taught at Nashotah House, Church History and Liturgics. His PhD is from St. Andrews. This was actually his St. Andrews dissertation that's been revised. And he's even right now working on what he calls like a reader-friendly introduction to Pusey's theology and spirituality, which is great. We don't have enough reader-friendly kinds of things dedicated to Pusey. And even though the Sacramental Vision book might not be reader-friendly in the sense of, everyone, it is an accessible book. And so I was reading that book and realized that, Father Toby really understands Pusey's reliance on the patristics, and that would include monastic authors from the patristics that were greatly influential on Pusey, and not just in Pusey's sacramental vision, but in other ways that I'm convinced are there as well. So Father Toby is going to be one of our speakers. I should also say he's currently an assisting priest out in Peoria, Illinois, with the Diocese of Quincy. And then the other person I've invited and who's accepted is Dr. Sarenhead James. He's a tutor in ecclesiastical history at St. Stephen's House in Oxford. His degrees are from Durham and Oxford. And he's the author of the Cowley Fathers, which is a history of the Anglican Society of St. John the Evangelist. I mean, really the definitive history. The Cowley Fathers have ceased to exist in England, unfortunately, but the American branch is still open. But Dr. James wrote that definitive history published in 2019 with Canterbury Press. And so he knows the Anglican, he's not the only one, but he knows the Anglican monastic context really well, and has done a deep dive, obviously, in the Cowley Fathers. And so I thought he would be a really great person to invite to come and kind of do the more contemporary, so Father Toby is going to do Pusey kind of on the patristics and how that might have been influenced by the monastic authors. And then Dr. James is going to look at Pusey's active ministry of going to France to study religious communities.
Wow. Yeah, that will be quite a conference. It sounds like awesome. For those who don't know the history of Anglicanism, obviously under Henry VIII, we had the monasteries dissolved. So there really wasn't very much monastic activity. Like you said, Mary Hughes, the first woman to take vows. So beyond just being present for that, what role did Pusey play in the restoration of monastic life in England?
Yeah, so we do have, examples from the dissolution and before 1842 of where, like Anna Collette at the Little Gidding community, at least we have a document where she talks like her vow of virginity. But Marian Hughes took what are the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So they're not the Benedictine vows, for example, but they are the kind of traditional religious life vows. So the role that, but this flowering that came as a result of the Oxford movement in the 19th century, and so much with Pusey. I mean, first, Pusey was just a fan of monasticism, and not like, I mean, for those who might be watching this as a video, this office that you can see in the background is full of like monastic trinkets and memorabilia that are gifts from students, because when you work on that for a living, they have a fun time giving you monastic things. And so, but so he wasn't like just interested in like monastic memorabilia like I am in some degree, but like he was a real fan of its reintroduction. And so like a couple of quotes that I think really illustrate this. He wrote once, the church has in her monastic institutions a refuge from the weariness and vanities of the world, and a means of higher perfectioned individuals, which many sigh after and which might be revived in a primitive form, but which as yet we have not. A little prescient there, as of yet we have not. And then another place he wrote, the monastic system is favorable to higher devotion, but it is through the virtues exercised in it. Sacramental grace is common to all. More is given as there is greater longing, greater denial of self, greater use of what is given. So the two things we can see there, and the one, he's thinking in both cases that monastic institutions lead to greater devotion. But the one, he's saying like, hey, sacramental grace is common to all, but there is this other thing, this, I don't know, higher thing, maybe we would say it, or something like that. I mean, he does use like those who have a greater longing, a greater denial. And so first of all, he's just a big fan of monasticism and its reintroduction. But then he actively worked to reintroduce it, right? So that's kind of what we see with even Marian Hughes, is that he promoted its reintroduction on the ground, feet on the ground. For example, he toured France, examining the rules of Roman Catholic women's communities over there. And he was doing that not, again, just to be archaic, but because he wanted to learn from them so he could come back and advise what was actually happening in England. What would be the best forms of religious life that women could take. And so that in part led him to hear the vows of Marian Hughes. But I think a greater flourishing of his kind of boots on the ground perspective is in 1844, there was a committee that was working to set up a women's community in London. And so they were looking for a woman who could lead that endeavor. And it was going to be called the Village Park Sisterhood. It was called the Village Park Sisterhood when it was founded. Pusey couldn't recommend anyone. He just was unaware of any women who could lead it, because he didn't know of anyone who had been formed yet properly in the monastic life to come and lead that endeavor. But instead, he ended up arranging for a woman named Jane Ellicombe, who was the daughter of a friend of his, to found a community. And so he ensured that she was formed for the monastic life, so that in March of 1845, Jane, alongside some other women, and they were soon joined by like 5 additional women, eventually founding the Sisterhood of the Holy Cross, would be a viable community. So in the one hand, Pusey's like, well, I don't know of anyone. But on the other hand, he's like, but we could form someone to help found it. And so again, he's very much just actively doing it. So he's a fan of the reintroduction of monasticism, and then he was a boots on the ground person to actually make it happen.
Very cool. You've obviously done a lot of work in monasticism, and not just the history of it, but potential applications to the church today. And that is one of the cool features of the conference, that it's not just about the kind of excavation of Pusey and his work on this topic, but how we in the church might appropriate some of what he did there in our own context. So I'm just curious, and we had a listener, Jeff, who's a member of our Communion of Patreon Saints, who submitted a question where he was kind of wondering in general, but we might tie it a little specifically to Pusey. What can be gained by a recovery of monasticism by Anglicans?
Yeah. Pusey alludes to it in that one quotation. Newman was even clearer. The Anglican Newman was even clearer in a couple of letters. Newman gets right to the heart of the issue. He says, men and women are going to leave Anglicanism if we do not provide them with a monastic system. Because he knew. So we might think of it like this, it might be tempting to think, oh, people want something more. They want something deeper, right? And so they go looking for it, right? And this might be, in parish ministry, you might have a parishioner come and say, oh, Father, I'm going to go on a retreat because I really just need to get away, right? To kind of experience God. And What you really wish they would ask for would be more Eucharist, but instead they go on a retreat or something like that. So Newman was aware that was going to happen, but I take that a step further and say probably what Newman was really aware of and thinking about was God is going to call Anglican men and women to the monastic life, and they need somewhere to go and work that out. And if there's that vocation, that divine vocation, if there's nowhere to go and work that out, they're going to leave. They're going to convert to Roman Catholicism, which I know he did eventually himself. But he, again, and that's what kind of Pusey is getting at too, that there are people that want something greater, right? So this isn't an argument for the superiority of the monastic life. It is a much more pastoral argument that says, priests, rectors, vicars, curates are going to have men and women called to the religious life. And where are they going to be able to go if we don't have monastic life, right? So that was a great part of the argument. And I think that still holds true today, right? I mean, yeah, is it few and far between? Maybe, but that's God's business, not ours, right? This isn't a promotion we're running, join the religious life and, gain some favor with God, but this is we're going to have people who feel called to the religious life, and we need to be able to have places that they can go and be formed and live out that life, right? And so I think that's why that's the difference that the monastic life needs. That's what it does. It's like, to me, and maybe this is because I am the choir that I preach to all the time, is just like, you would never say like, maybe we shouldn't put so much stock into this thing called marriage. Like, whatever, it's unnecessary, because everyone who feels called to marriage is going to say, wait a second, why aren't we performing marriages anymore? Well, think about if you're, a person who feels called to religious life in 1840, well, maybe we should say even like 1820. By 1840, there was enough movement that those people probably knew they were going to have a place to go. But, 1820, immediately there's no place that's going to meet that. This is a calling of God on your life. What are you going to do? Well, I guess I'll have to convert, go over to France probably, and live out my religious life. So I think we need to keep bearing that in mind, even in the contemporary church, is to say, you know what, we're not making an argument for the superiority of the monastic life over any other form of life, but we are saying God calls people to it, and we want to be able to respond to that. We have to respond to it.
Right. Well, I'm curious. So listeners know I'm outside of Baltimore, sort of in between Baltimore and DC, and I know of one community. I've led a retreat there, kind of outside of Baltimore, in a town called Catonsville, where it was an Episcopal convent, and then in the 90s they ended up switching, converting to Catholicism because there simply wasn't the institutional support for them in the Episcopal Church anymore, and really I think they were dying out too. So where in the Anglican world is this happening now? I mean, if listeners want to check out Anglican monasticism, I mean, what are some places they can look?
Oh, great question. So, I mean, one of a good community that has a long history here in the United States, though they're quite small now, is the community of St. Mary, just up near Albany, New York. It's a great place where a woman who might feel called to the monastic life could go, an Anglican religious community there. Unfortunately, men's religious life, monastic life in the United States seems to be dying out in the Anglican context. There's St. Gregory's in Three Rivers, Michigan, historically Episcopalian, and the Cowley Fathers are still here in the U.S. But there are other communities in England, and in fact, just last week, a new website was launched, Anglican Religious Life Project. .org.uk. So Anglican Religious Life Project .org.uk was launched, and the whole purpose of that is to be a place where people can come. I mean, it sounds, I don't want to be crass, like one-stop shopping for the religious life, right? and not because then you can like follow links to the community, so that might be true of the website, but it's a way of saying like, here's what the religious life is. Here's kind of how it functions in the church, in relationship to the church, and then it probably will direct you out to things. I mean, for years and years, every year there's a religious life handbook that's been published by like Canterbury Press I think now that's mostly an online access too. But that's where I mean, if you would go, or you could be like, I get a lot of emails because people find me or recommend it to me. But yeah, there's a movement now within Anglicanism to try to bring religious life to the fore again, in a way that's, even the evangelical Archbishop George Carey argued for monastic life, and of course, Rowan Williams has says positive things his whole career about that, and then of course Archbishop Welby started the St. Anselm community out of Lambeth, which is a non-traditional monastic community, but a championing of the monastic and religious life. So yeah, so there's good places to there's a website you can go to. I mean, but there's also real monks and nuns that you can meet too, and they're often obviously the best at explaining the religious life because they live it. Yeah,
I'm curious how you might respond to an objection. I heard this from a Roman Catholic recently. I think it was maybe when I posted that we were going to have you on, and their objection was something along the lines, basically, that one of the main reasons that Anglicanism has had a tough time maintaining a monastic life is because of the kind of thesis behind the daily office, and that in monasticizing the country, they created kind of a lack of, or they removed the need for actual monasteries. I don't think that's true, but when I say it, nobody cares. So why is that not true?
Well, maybe they still won't care, but I think the reason that it is very clear, the Book of Common Prayer is monastic in its origin. And yes, I mean, Cranmer was like, hey, who can't pray 7 times a day is a farmer. But who could pray 2 times a day is a farmer, or something like that. So it is clear that the Book of Common Prayer, I think that's been established beyond doubt now. But I don't think that would account for, leaving the actual, historical reasons for the dissolution aside. I mean, James Clark just published kind of now the definitive book on that, on the dissolution with Yale University Press. But leaving that aside, all the reasons that are easy Twitter fodder for, claiming about Henry VIII. But the point is like, I think what the monasticizing the country, if you will, didn't make it so that people wouldn't have to go to a monastery. Because that's not, you don't go to a monastery just to pray. You go to a monastery because, again, I'm returning back now to the vocation language, because God calls you to it. Now, sometimes people hear their calling because others help them hear the calling. And if you don't think monasticism is a call, then you're not going to ever be able to sit with someone and say, oh, it could be that that's a monastic call, right? Now, not every single celibate life is monastic, right? That's different. But I actually think what Anglicanism did was, yes, it brought monastic spirituality out of the monasteries and put it into the general populace. But inadvertently, it was just the proverbial monastic baby was thrown out with the bathwater. It was a loss that was recognized very early on. And I wrote a book called Reforming the Monastery, which has a chapter on Anglicanism. And the point is like, there's a history between the dissolution and the mid-19th century of lots of people saying, hey, this is like, we got rid of a really useful institution. We never should have done that. And not just useful as in like, like when Edmund Burke makes the argument, to the French, like, why are you closing the monasteries? They're the best at taking care of poor people in rural villages. That's not the argument they're making. Oh no, who's going to care for social, who's going to do social works in these rural villages? Though that's a good question to ask as well. But this was like, oh no, we've gotten rid of something that some people still seem to be called to. What do we do? And well, what people did oftentimes was either they didn't follow through with that call, or they converted and went and lived out that call elsewhere. So I think that's important to realize, is that something was lost that then put it out of the mental landscape of priests and directors and spiritual companions to say, oh, maybe this is a monastic call, because it was lost in the imagination, if you will, in the Anglican context writ large.
Mhm.
And so part of what had to be done in the 19th century was, like not normalizing, but showing that this was not like a Roman Catholic, return and invention, but this was always in the warp and woof of what it meant to be the Christian church. And then to have people like, Marion Hughes say, I'm called to this, and other women and men step forward and say, I'm called to this.
Yeah. It is very different, I guess. I did a funeral recently with a Redemptorist priest, and he brought down his Redemptorist brothers to help with the thing. But they all live, in community, but their community's attached to a parish. And I've always thought that was kind of cool how, parishioners in the church see that community life, and not all of those parishioners will be called to monastic life, but it does show them just naturally that this is an option for you, and if you don't ever have that, it would be sort of out of left field, I guess, for people.
Well, and I remember when I was talking to the former superior of a Roman Catholic women's community, and when she was the superior, the abbess, there were like 1,100 nuns in the community. So I was talking to her and I said, there's no way you knew all of those nuns. And she acknowledged that she could pass probably a sister on the street and wouldn't have known that she was one of her sisters. But she said, but I knew in general where everyone was at. And she goes, we never had all of them living at the house, right? Because they were scattered out doing different kinds of work. And of course, one of the main works and whole religious order sprung up to do this was to become religious educators at parish level. But then talking to her, like, why were so many women joining, the religious life at that time? And she said, well, because it used to be that there was not, you didn't grow up Roman Catholic without seeing monks and nuns on a regular basis. Being involved in your parish, the director of religious ed was almost always a religious sister, right? Many parochial schools were run by religious. And so she said, we saw it was an option. People talked about it as an option. And so I think you kind of work that backwards and you say, well, if there's no place to send someone, then it's out of mind. You're not going to be talking to someone. You're going to, Father, I might be called to the religious life. Like, well, that's impossible. We don't have monasteries. How could God call you to that?
Yes.
So.
Yep. Great example of that in film, I think, is the movie Doubt. You got Meryl Streep, Democratic nun who runs the parochial school.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I sympathize with her character because she's big into fountain pens. Her criticism of the young priest is he uses a ballpoint pen.
Yeah,
I want to return to tradition.
That's right. There you go. Led by the sisters. That's right. Yeah. Well, and then you always have the stereotypical, the mean teacher nun who wraps your fingers with the ruler. I mean, it's a trope because it was true. There was a truthfulness to at least the ubiquity of these men and women in the lives of young people. That is, I mean, it's lost in the Roman Catholic Church now too, but obviously clearly lost in in Anglicanism with the dissolution for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'd be interested, since we're talking about Pusey and all this, to step back a little and talk about his spirituality in general. And I think you've already kind of hinted at some interesting features of his spirituality. We did an episode in the past on the love of God and of Jesus for souls and the blessedness of intercession for them, which is a fantastic book. I mean, it's a short read, but the sermons or the talks he gives at the retreat are quite amazing, I think. One of the interesting things I've always liked about Pusey is that he is an interesting blend of things. I mean, on the one hand, he is certainly influenced by the Anglican tradition, particularly as he comes to understand it as a member of the Oxford movement. Heavy emphasis on scripture, heavy emphasis on patristic tradition. On the other hand, though, he is influenced quite a bit by Roman Catholic devotions. I mean, it comes through in his talks. Quite a bit, and going to France and studying how they were doing women's religious life and all that. And I think there's also a bit of his spirituality which may have come from his kind of overbearing father, and how that had an effect on him long term. But I'm just interested if you could talk a little bit about all these factors kind of at work in him, and maybe how it comes to bear on his attempt to revive monasticism a little bit.
Yeah, I'll try to speak to that. Yeah, I mean, Pusey is a fascinating individual because he had such a deep piety in the best sense of the word, though ostensibly he spent his life in what should have been a pretty heady environment. as a university professor for over 50 years. But yet had this deep, deep piety. I think a lot of it goes back to like things you just noticed. He was a student of the fathers, and so he learned from the fathers that theology is never separated. I mean, theology is life. That's not abstract, theologizing. I mean, yes, it can be, but those become separated, I think, more like with scholasticism in the 13th century. And so certainly he's reading that, like, the fathers are just influential in informing him that when you do theology, the life of prayer is essential to it, and not to, the overused quotation from Evagrius Pontus, a theologian is one who prays and one who prays is a theologian. But my guess is Pusey really believed that. Second of all, again, like because of his Oxford, movement leanings, that's his sacramental life, his sacramentology, they were essential for him. As means of grace. And, even in the quotation I read earlier, he sees like, well, sacramental grace is there for everyone, but there is perhaps something more and something bigger. And I think that's the part I want to kind of latch on to about Pusey's spirituality is like, I think Pusey just had a sense that you're never quite there. Right. I mean, there's something more. You should always be, disciplining yourself for the purpose of godliness. And there should be a little something more. I mean, it's right in those quotations I read, a means of a higher perfection. The monasticism is able to higher devotion. Now, that language could be wrought with problematic elements to it. Like back in the early church, there was the arguments, even by Clement of Alexandria, the 30, 1600-fold return, like married people, sorry, you're going to get a 30-fold return because you're mucking about with sex and money, but if you get widowed and you don't remarry, your return goes up to 60, but it's the monks and the nuns, the virgins that are going to get the 100-fold. And that's just the way it is. I'm not making an argument that's what Pusey thought at all. But I think there is a sense of where he understands this ongoing pursuit, needs to be pursued. I also think a big influence on him is Hurrell Froude. Now, Hurrell Froude doesn't get talked about a lot anymore because he died young. But even though Pusey married in his late 20s, he had been friends with Froude for a while at that point. Froude had gone up to Oriel in 1821, so he's there at the same time as Pusey. Froude was tutored by Keble, but this is obviously a friend group that are cross-pollinating one another. When Froude always had really strong views about the ascetic life, and when he died young, I guess he was like consumptive, they call it, and so he died young, and then Keble and Newman published his remains, right? So that's the genre of like what's laying on the desk and in the closets, and let's publish it all. So they did, and his very anti-Reformation views came out, but also what came out is his deep, extreme practices of self-denial and asceticism, including like sleeping on the floor, very sparse diet. I mean, this was scandalous. The remains were quite scandalous to a lot of people. But you got to think like Pusey was friends with, Newman, Keble, Froude. Think about these men, right? Think about that influence you're going to have, the kind of poetic piety, if you will, of a Keble, right? Parish-based, the kind of heady piety of a Newman. But then you've got the friend that sleeps on the floor, right? As intentional self-denial, like I think that's just all going to work together to create a person like Pusey. And it could be that, Froude's influence, on Pusey could, like Pusey's experience with his father could have been redeemed to some extent by Froude's vision of a self-denial, of a harsh form of living on purpose. So yeah, I really think we need to, when we look at Pusey, we need to understand that, like, and this is Father Karlowicz's book gets at this too, even though it's not ostensibly about his spirituality, but it's like that sacramental vision he had, that almost everything is pointing to some greater reality, that everything is pointing to God, and these lesser goods are always about the greatest good. That very Augustinian, that deeply Augustinian sense. I think Pusey just lived that out. And so his spirituality takes not different forms, like you can't put an adjective on the front of it, like, oh, he had a Benedictine spirituality for a season and a Celtic spirituality, but he just, in his whole person over a long life, very consistently held together the heart, the mind, the body. But I think at the end of the day, again, not just fruit being understudied, but probably an understudied element of even Pusey's life is his ascetical life. I think that's something that needs to be studied to really show that his spirituality was in large part very much an incarnated lifestyle.
So I know, kind of over the history of studying Pusey, there's been a number of shifts in terms of the kind of historiography about him, and so I mean, for example, one iteration of that, or one wave of that historiography, which was sort of anti Pusey, would highlight kind of his severity. He sort of ruined his wife, who was this fun-loving woman, and then they married, and she became very dour. And his brother didn't want his children to live with them if anything happened to him, and all these kind of things get kind of highlighted. He prescribed hair shirts as penance.
And wore one.
Yes. So I'm just interested to know your assessment, kind of on the modern state of Pusey scholarship. Obviously, at the beginning, there's competing hagiographies and criticisms tied very closely to churchmanship debates, especially as ritualism and Anglo-Catholicism are emerging. But it does seem like there's been a reevaluation. But at the same time, there's not a ton of literature out there. I mean, Father Toby's book is new, but before that, I mean, like Perry Butler's Pusey Rediscovered, I think is from the 80s. So it's been a while, since. So what are current themes, foci, emphases in contemporary studies on Pusey? Where could there be some more work done? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, sure. So there is a book on Pusey and his theology of the Eucharist, and unfortunately it's escaping me, but it's in I feel like it's a Bruhl series, which might mean you need to, sell a card to pay for it. But but it is in paperback, and I'm sorry it's sitting on my desk at home. But so there is that work being done. So I mean, obviously Father Toby with Pusey's sacramental vision, his sacramentology, but that would also be the book on the Eucharist.
It's Brian Douglas's book, The Eucharistic Theology of
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. It's on the read soon pile. So, and again, I think that there's that element of Pusey's sacramental theology. Father Toby has, in his book, pointed out the need to dive deeper into Pusey's understanding of scriptural interpretation, his infamous types and prophecies of the Old Testament. I don't know if you know this, Father Wesley, but the story of this is George Westaver, the principal of Pusey House, wrote a thesis on it. The problem is there's never been an edition because I think, Pusey's Liddon and those didn't think that book's not going to sell. No one's interested in that. Turns out, though, now no one can read Pusey's handwriting. So it's become very problematic. I think Father George ostensibly has said more than once he's working on an edition. Let's hope that that's going to happen.
I have a story about this, but I'll tell it to you after.
Okay, good. I hope you know something. So, but I think if that can happen, I mean, there's more and more interest in his understanding of Scripture. In the way in which he adopted figural reading, and of course that's big in Anglican circles. There's several people who are doing some good work there. Then I think also an area that's starting to get some attention, and again, probably through Toby's work, is like his, and this is what the Breck Conference wants to do, is look deeper at Pusey and his connections to the patristic church. And not just who did he use, but even his own, how he used them, right? So studies of not just where do we see his use of the fathers, but really try to get our head around how he's using them. And right, that's always, even when you quote from a church father, what you quote matters, and what you don't quote in the surrounding context, reveals a lot too. So there is like the kind of historical, oh, he was such a, kind of downer person. And by the way, I mean, I'm a little careful to, I don't want to associate that with his asceticism,
right.
Like, somehow bodily asceticism just makes you a miserable person. But I mean, yeah, okay. So that aside, but I think there is some work that is being done, some more that needs to be done. And I think those are, again, the sacramentology, scriptural interpretation, and then I think his use of the patristics are things that are being worked on now. But it's not many people sit down and read Liddon's 4-volume Life of Pusey. Which so much of that, as you probably know, is just like quotations from the things he said. And I mean, it's a rich study still. But yeah, it'd be great if we could. I think Newman has by far taken the lion's share of all the. I mean, think about even Keble, Froude, Pusey. I mean, none of them are really studied like they should be, given their significance, not just to the Oxford movement, but to, revivalism and to renewal of theology and sacraments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That is one thing I guess we didn't talk about earlier was Pusey's, as a biblical scholar is kind of really pretty interesting and very phenomenal guy. I mean, he did his study in Germany.
That's right.
Under higher critics. So he was well versed in what was going on and kind of at the cutting edge of his field on that. But then sort of rejected that higher critical approach in adopting the figural reading. It's very interesting. In a way, he kind of foreshadows, I think, what some of the movements we see happening now with them taking back up a figural reading, canonical approach, all that kind of stuff. It's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, but also I think that's rooted. I mean, this is where and it's probably rooted in the same for even like a Brever Childs or the more recent people. I mean, if you're going to read Augustine, I mean, you're going to get figural reading, and I mean, including just in the Confession. So not even in, you don't have to go to the On Christian Teaching. I mean, and I mean, Pusey did a translation in addition of the Confession. Yep. So, he knows what's there in books, 11 and 12 about, the multiple meanings of text from Genesis. And I think he, and again, even that, and maybe someone's done this, obviously I'm not a Pusey expert, but but who's really looked at, what did Pusey read? I mean, I know Father Toby gets a little bit of this, but what did he read? What exactly is he rejecting? Because, you say German higher criticism, it's like, well, right, what is that? I mean, that's a lot, and a lot of people. Yeah, I think that's a great thing, but a lot of it is going to depend on the ability to interact with a reliable edition of the types and prophecies of the Old Testament. And so, Father George Westaver, if you're listening to this, and you should be, please give us that gift.
Hopefully, future guest of the show, Father George Westaver.
Good.
Father Creighton went to the conference over there this past summer and connected with him, and so we're hoping eventually to have him on. And I will certainly we'll certainly turn up the heat on that particular point. Yeah. We need it. We need it.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it.
Well, very good, very good. Well, thank you for coming on, talking about Pusey, someone that we're very fond of here. To kind of end our discussions, we like to sort of lighten things up a little bit and talk about something that we're into, some sort of book, movie, experience, activity, whatever. So, Father Greg, what are you into these days?
Okay, well, I've got a 21-year-old and a nearly 18-year-old, so they're always telling me about TV shows. So I'm gonna refrain from revealing my TV watching life based on my children's recommendations. But the thing that I've been for the past few years, I've been reading fiction by early 20th century French Roman Catholic novelists like George Bernanos, Francois Marioc. And thanks to Clooney Media putting a lot of this back in print. Man, I have just been, what am I into? I am nerding out on that stuff. Let me tell you that. I mean, I have just been shouting it from the rooftops of how, and I don't mean, there's always usually a tragic priestly figure in those novels. So that might have been why I read Diary of a Country Priest originally by Bernanos. But what I'm realizing is their psychological insights rival Dostoevsky's, when it comes to the Russian side of things. And so I'm not going to, I'm reading everything I can get my hands on by those two authors. And even this probably won't surprise many people at all, but Hans Urs von Balthasar, sat down one day and wrote 350 pages on Bernanos. And so I'm looking forward to reading his study of him. So.
That's awesome. There's nothing better than the 20th century Catholic novel. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm a little slow to that time period, to that place, but man, once I found it, I've been just
Endo, Graham Greene, Walker Percy. It's just all that's a rabbit hole we could definitely go down for quite a while. So good. For me, in parish ministry, I have kind of an aging congregation. Certainly we have an influx of young people, especially lately, but we have the majority of our congregation's a little older, and so a lot of what I end up doing is pastoral visits, which I love doing. In some ways, they always make me a little nervous because, you're going into a situation and you're not always sure what the other person is gonna say, need, and part
Yeah.
of our job is to kind of diagnose what's going on under the surface anyways. So there's always kind of this prayerful approach with a little bit of anxiety or a little nervousness, which I don't think is bad. It just is the way it is. And I mean, fortunately, we have a prayer book that walks us through some things to say, but you still have to interact with people. And so I got a book recently called Pastoral Visitation
Oh, yeah.
for the Care of Souls by Tyler C. Arnold, Lexham Press book. I haven't gotten very far into it, but I have found it helpful
That's
just
awesome.
in terms of conceptualizing what the mission is, how to go about doing that, all that kind of stuff. And so I hope to kind of refine my approach to the pastoral visit and hopefully perfect it. Put in my 10,000
That's great.
hours.
Yeah, that's awesome, because that's a whole series they've got,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Such and such for the cure of souls or something like that. Yeah. So it's good to hear that's good
the
stuff.
editor is Harold. I don't know how to say his last name. Sinkbill, something like that. But he's a Lutheran. But I always found him to be very thoughtful and
Nice.
and very pastoral. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to getting a little further into that, because I think there will be a lot of fruit there. So excellent. Well, Dr. Peter or Father Peters, thank you so much for joining us. If people want to sign up for the Breck Conference, how can they do that?
So you go to Nashotah, NASHOTAH.edu/Breck.
Excellent.
And you can follow the link for registration. And we'll be giving away through an essay contest. It's not a long essay, just a very brief thing. We will be giving away one full scholarship for the Breck to waive the registration fees. And so that details are on there too. And there's a deadline. But that's how you can go register for it.
Excellent. Well, hopefully listeners, you will take them up on that opportunity, because it sounds awesome. And Dr. Peters, if people want to follow you, where can they do that?
Well, my social media presence is very thin. But I mean, to be honest with you, I'm old school. Feel free to just email me, and happy to chat. But that's the main. I don't really have a social media presence that's worth following. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's probably a good sign these days, anyways. So
yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit of a necessity, but both because I'm a little bit archaic myself, but also just like, the time and effort that it takes is just not. Yeah, I'd also have to be convinced that anyone wants to really hear my thoughts on much of anything. So
sure. Well, we are appreciative for your thoughts. So thank you for coming on.
Appreciate it.
And listeners, you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, all the social medias that Father Peters does not have.
I didn't say I didn't have them. I just said I'm not good at using them.
There we go. So anyways, you can follow us there. Please, we would appreciate it if you would rate, review, subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts or videos. And of course, you're always welcome to join the communion of Patreon saints for just $5 a month. To close us out, I will pray a collect for E.B. Pusey. So let us pray. Almighty God, you gave your servant Edward Bouvier Pusey special gifts of grace to understand and teach the truth revealed in Christ Jesus. Grant that by his teaching we may know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.